let's see, what did she leave out? I've worked in both the private, public, and academia, so I've got a round of that. Prior to working for the city of Benbrook, I was on their Planning and Zoning Commission for 5 years, 4 of which is chairman, so I feel your pain. I've been in your shoes, I don't know what you're going through, and it's always good to have a little bit of knowledge is dangerous, but I always felt that as a staff member, my job was to keep the planning commissioners out of jail. So what I want to do is try to give you enough of a background so that you don't make any mistakes as you go through the process. Standard, put your cell phones on silent. I guess pagers makes me seem old, but does anybody have a pager anymore? So, we're going to go through some, even though Tamara said that I had a little bit extra time, we're going to go through some of this a little fast, but the important thing is to ask questions. And so some of these slides you may have seen before, but the presentation is going to be different depending on what you all want to talk about. So be sure and ask those questions. So you've been appointed to the B&Z, and about half of you are P&Z members, half of you are staff. Hopefully your city provided you some orientation when you were appointed to the P&Z. I am surprised that in some cities that doesn't happen. You're just kind of thrown into the wolves, or you go in with the idea that, well, I know everything, I don't need to have any training. But what we're going to try to do is give you a little bit of background on that. So even though the agenda, I think, says I'm going to talk about the basics of development review, what I want to do mainly this morning is kind of give you a basis, kind of a context to do that development review by giving you basics in planning and development regulation. And basically we're going to talk about planning and development regulation as kind of two different things. Planning is that vision of the future. What is it that you want to be when you grow up? What does your city aspire to be? And interestingly, cities have different aspirations. Some cities want to be a veteran community. Some people want to maintain that small town character. Some want to have economic vibrancy. So there's all kinds of different approaches, and so your plans reflect those, hopefully. There's lots of different ways of doing planning. We're going to talk a little bit about comprehensive planning, but we'll also talk about strategic planning and then special area planning. And most cities' ordinance or plans now are kind of a combination usually of comprehensive and strategic planning. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's the vision. What is it that you want to be when you grow up? The second part is the development regulation. What are the tools that we can use to get to that vision? And make sure that you look at those two together, because sometimes some people will say, well, I have this vision of having affordable housing that's affordable to all generations, and then set up development regulations that make it unaffordable for people to own houses in their community. So make sure that you look at those two aspects together. We'll talk about, actually at the bottom of the slide, talks about conformity as a concept of how well do your regulations conform to the plan. And sometimes you need to step back and do an audit of your regulations to see, in effect, are you really trying to achieve what you want to do? Some cities are now actively working on mixed use districts, and then you go back to their ordinances that say, no, you can't mix uses, or you can't have density. Everybody's got to have a 2-acre lot, and then they wonder why they have sprawl. So think about those. Different types of development regulations, we can divide those into proactive and reactive. Proactive tools are those where the city actually has skin in the game. So capital improvements, where are you going to build your new streets, your new public facilities to help stimulate growth in certain areas? You're actually putting city money toward those. And secondly is public-private partnerships. Projects where the city is actively participating in a development project with the idea that by doing that, you can help shape how that development occurs. Those are the proactive approaches. The vast majority of the time, what you're considering are reactive approaches. A developer walks in the door and says, I want to do this. And your response is, well, yes or no, or yes if you do this or that. How do you help guide that private development so that it meets your aims as part of your comprehensive plan. You know, I tell my students that, you know, the vast majority of the city is not built by the city, it's built by private development. You know, a developer built the street in front of your house, built the sidewalk, built all the utilities in your neighborhood. The job of the city is to make sure that the facilities are built in the right spot and that are built to the quality that the city can take care of them when the city takes over the operation and maintenance of those. Number of different approaches in the reactive is zoning, which is usually part of the name of the group that you sit on, the Planning and Zoning Commission. We'll talk a little bit about that. But also subdivision approval is probably a big part of how planning is, you know, what facilities actually get built. And then you may have a myriad of other regulations that may affect planning, including what Doug mentioned was tree preservation ordinances. And I may make a comment or two, even though I'm on tape, I may make a comment or two about our legislature. It's kind of interesting that the Republican Party, which used to be known for, you know, government closest to the people, has now decided that Austin is the best level of government, and they're trying to preempt all local regulations. So, but be that as it may, and I tend to be kind of moderate Republican, so I say that with, unlike a lot of my colleagues who, you know, a lot of people think planners are liberal because we're trying to regulate everything. That's not really true. I mean, planning is really a nonpartisan issue. And in fact, planning started 100 years ago as an economic development tool. The idea is that if we could develop an atmosphere in our communities, such as the city of Chicago, it would help spur economic development, spur job growth, et cetera. All things that, you know, Republicans would normally aspire to. I kind of wonder sometimes now. Enough said there, unless you ask me questions. So I do like to talk a little bit about the importance of planning. A lot of times people question, you know, why do we do this planning? Some people say, well, you know, Houston doesn't have any planning, which is not really true. Houston at some points in time has one of the largest planning departments in the entire state. They don't have zoning, but that's really not true either because they do a lot of land use regulation through deed covenants and restrictions. So each individual development has its own regulations. It's just not an overall zoning process. Anyway, about 15, 17 years ago, the national APA did a study. Remember, we just had a new president come into office, conservative. The idea was, well, there might be an attack on planning. So they did a survey of likely voters to see what their attitudes were about planning. And the results were that most people wanted to have a professional planning in their community, and us planners like that. They wanted schools, public services, parks, recreation, preserve open space, protect natural areas, create affordable housing options. Those are all planning issues. But we in Texas said, yeah, that's nice, but we Texans are different than the rest of the country, so our attitudes might be different. So the actual Texas chapter commissioned a similar survey, same survey firm, of Texas voters. And we found it's important to have a community planner, we want to protect open spaces, we want to provide incentives for affordable housing, you know, so there's a little slight difference in wording there. Create transportation options and support the right of local communities to make decisions for private property. Very similar approach to the idea that there's strong citizen support for planning activities. So 2012, we thought, well, the survey was somewhat dated. Let's go back and look at it. We also looked at that also from an economic development standpoint of how planning relates to economic development issues. So the question was, some people believe that community planning is necessary, while others think that market forces can help the economy. Which comes closest to your belief? You've all heard the issue, well, if we just let the market take care of things, everything will be just fine. The answer is that 2/3 of people believe that you need both community planning and market forces to achieve economic growth. And you'll notice that even though there's some minor differences between political affiliation, race, and type of community, all in all, most people felt that planning was a necessary part. You need to have both. You can't have planning and ignore the market. I mean, just simply drawing red on the map saying, well, this is going to be commercial, and the market's not there to support it, it's not going to be commercial. But likewise, you can't rely solely on market forces. You need to have that balance to achieve the two. Some people believe their community needs planning, while others think it should be left alone. Which comes closest? Again, 2/3 say planning is needed. Only about 20% said planning is not needed, and about 20% said they don't know. And almost 3/4 agree that communities that plan for the future are stronger and more resilient than those that don't. And again, although there's some minor differences, there's a broad level of agreement between party affiliation, race, and type of community on these issues. Also, they asked, well, what do you think is the ideal community? What would you like to see? This is ranked in order of highest priority. Most people wanted locally owned businesses nearby, not just chain stores, but locally owned businesses. Being able to stay in the same neighborhood while aging. So as you age, you might move from, the singles bachelor pad to the suburb, the house in the suburb with yard for the kids, versus something more amenable to seniors, but to be able to do that within the same neighborhood as opposed to having to move across town to find those housing types. The availability of sidewalks to be able to walk. There was a large period during our history where we did not build sidewalks. We designed everything so that you had to have an automobile, and then we wonder why there's traffic problems. It's because we've not allowed options for other ways to get around. So people want to have sidewalks, energy efficient homes, availability of transit, neighborhood parks, etc. Interestingly enough, the ones that came in low were a place with lots of young children. I guess it's those old fogies like me who don't want those loud screaming kids anymore. And in houses that are generally the same size. Now think about it. What does zoning create? It creates housing all the same size. So we need to think about how we are setting up those regulations so that we're not creating homogeneous areas that typically, there'll be a generation that moves in, then everybody moves out, and then the housing stock is no longer necessarily appropriate to the people who are still there. So how are we dealing with those issues? I want to talk a little bit about comprehensive planning, just because that's kind of the underlying vision of our community. What is it that we want to be? Comprehensive planning looks at more than just the physical design of the community, but also looks at the interrelationship of land use, infrastructure, community facilities, and other community programs. How can we kind of integrate all of our planning efforts into a single comprehensive plan? Brief history, comprehensive planning has been around since the early part of the 20th century. Cincinnati is usually attributed to having the first true comprehensive plan. In 1928, the U.S. government promulgated the Standard City Planning Enabling Act, which included both subdivision and comprehensive planning as part of it. So basically the Commerce Department said, here's a model set of legislation for the states to adopt for states that want to allow subdivision regulation and comprehensive planning. Texas, in its wisdom, adopted the subdivision part of the Standard City Planning Enabling Act in 1929, 1 year later. They didn't adopt the comprehensive planning part until 1999, so it took them a while to get it around to allow comprehensive planning to be part of the process. The big area and there were a lot of early comprehensive plans that were done, or things that could be attributed as comprehensive plans back in the 30s, but it really took a hold in the 1950s as part of the 701 program, which provided funding for cities to prepare general plans around the state. Yes, it was a federal, state administered program, but it gave a lot of cities the resources to be able to do that. I'll mention a couple of statutes, and the nice thing now is you can go on the internet and find these. This is in the local government code, which is a compilation of the state statutes related to local government, most of them. Chapter 213 is where the comprehensive planning enabling statute now resides. It says that the purposes are for sound development, health, safety, and welfare. You have to adopt your comprehensive plan now by ordinance. In the old days, you didn't. And if you're not adopting your plan by ordinance, you really should. And you have to have a review by the Planning Commission, and you need to have a public hearing. It allows each city to determine the level of conformity. Remember, conformity is the relationship between the plan and the regulations. You could have very strict conformity, which says that you can't change a zoning district if it conflicts with your comprehensive plan. Or you could decide that, hey, the plan's just a guide. We're going to adopt whatever zoning we want to adopt and not have very loose conformity. The important thing is it's up to each individual city to make that determination. So in your ordinance, you need to make sure that it says what level of conformity that you need to have. I used to work for the city of Benbrook, retired after 28 years, spent, as I said, 5 years on the P&Z, was also on the Home Rule Charter Commission for a year, so I'll refer to Benbrook. Benbrook had a very strict conformity requirement, so that you could not change the zoning or approve a thoroughfare that was in conflict with the comprehensive plan without going back to the plan and changing it as well. And the reason for that is it made you sit back and think bigger picture beyond the 200-foot limit of notice about what did this change really mean in the whole scheme of things. Now, a lot of times you did that simultaneous, it wasn't a big deal, but sometimes you had to kind of sit back, let's do the comprehensive plan amendment, and then we'll go back and do the zoning. It's up to each individual city now to make that determination. And then finally, as part of the sausage making that where statutes are made, we were in the Land and Resource Management Committee for the Texas House, and there was a legislator who shall remain nameless, but you know, we can't have comprehensive plans because those are regulations that take away people's property rights. So we said, no, not really. The comprehensive plan is just the overall guide. It's the zoning that's the regulation. Well, to get the bill through their committee, we had to add a disclaimer. So on your map for your comprehensive plan, you need to have a statement that says a comprehensive plan shall not constitute zoning regulations or establish zoning district boundaries. Yes, ma'am.
Where would you find the conformity requirements?
Well, that's for each city to do. It would typically be in the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance.
The overall one, or for the overall zoning ordinance?
Right. That probably, it would probably be where in your zoning ordinance where it talks about making zoning amendments. It'll probably have some reference to how it should conform to the comprehensive plan. State statute for a long time, in the zoning statute, we'll talk about that in a minute, said zoning shall be in conformance with the comprehensive plan, lowercase. And nowhere else in state law did it ever say what a comprehensive plan was. So the problem was the judges were making decisions about what a comprehensive plan was. And the term of art became that, well, if your map zoning map covers the entire city, that's comprehensive. And so that's all you needed. Well, so, then we had a case in East Dallas, town of Sunnyvale, where the developer brought in a development that was in conformance with the plan. City council, in their wisdom, turned it down. And the judge said, no, you have a comprehensive plan, you have to follow it. And we said, whoa, that's not really what we want either. So that's where this conformity requirement came in. So in each individual city's ordinances, take a look at what conformity, and it may not be in there. And that may be something you want to look at. Yes?
How does the comprehensive plan, the commission and the staff report, impact the Board of Adjustment? Because the
Yeah. And I was gonna make a comment about, have you posted a meeting of the Fort Worth Zoning Board of Adjustment? I noticed that there's lots of, no. And educational activity. Educational activities are exempt from those requirements. As a condition to approving a variance, you need to show that your approval conforms with the general plan of the community. All the other things you have to look at when you grant a variance, but it's also, are you still in the process of looking at how it conforms with the plan. You wouldn't want to grant a variance that was in direct conflict with your plan. And in most cases, it's probably not going to apply because the kinds of variances you're doing probably are not going to be that significant in terms of the whole scheme of the plan. But that's where the comprehensive plan would fall in with the zoning board of adjustment. We'll talk a little bit more about ZBA a little later. There's a couple of different approaches to planning. Excuse me. The comprehensive plan is one approach, and there's a process called the rational planning process, which is a way that you look at planning decision making. And if you thought about it, that's kind of what we do all the time. We look at existing conditions, identify the problem, identify what our goals and objectives are, look at alternative scenarios or alternative ways that we can approach things. We select one of those, implement it, evaluate it, and then that process kind of goes on. So that's one approach to doing the decision-making process. 1960s. Anybody there? The story is, if you can remember the 1960s, you probably weren't really there. So, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, under John Kennedy, brought in this process of strategic planning, of how to evaluate goals and objectives and mission statements, etc. It basically focuses on short-term, remember coming out of the military, short-term objectives and how to achieve those. So if your city has a mission statement, that came out of the strategic planning process. You look at internal strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, SWOT or SWOT analysis. You might have run across that. What is it that's affecting your unit that would affect how you would be able to achieve your mission? And you identify some possible scenarios. What may happen? What are the things that may change or go wrong, or how do you respond to those kinds of issues? That kind of contingency planning. And then you identify goals and objectives as related to your mission. Now, goals are, the overall, what the end state, what we want to be, how do we achieve things, we want, our goal is to have high quality of life, whatever that is. But to support those goals, you need to have some specific objectives. And objectives are measurable things that would move you toward achieving that goal. And we use what we call SMART as a way of identifying those objectives. So they're specific, measurable, attainable, results-bound, and time-bound. So that you might have an objective that, in support of the high quality of life, that we're going to reduce dilapidated housing in the neighborhood by 10% in the next 3 years. The responsible person is the director of the housing department, and then we're going to give him X number of dollars of resources to be able to do that. So when you talk about objectives, kind of look at them through that SMART lens to say, can we measure this? How do we know if we've achieved it? How do you know if you've achieved high quality of life? Well, you need to have something to measure against. And you kind of look at the comparison between what comprehensive planning and strategic planning is. Comprehensive planning tends to be long-term, generational, it's comprehensive, both in geographic, topical content. It's typically value-oriented, it uses policy guide, it is a continuous process. Strategic planning is short-term, mission-directed, typically 1 to 5 years, usually very narrow scope, Not we're gonna do all things for all people, but we're gonna look at a specific issue, typically be action-oriented, and does that SWOT analysis. In reality, most cities' plans are a combination of the two. So we have both traditional comprehensive plans, we have functional plans, so you probably have a drainage plan, or a parks plan, or a water and sewer plan. Those are all functional plans that get integrated into a comprehensive plan. You might have policy plans, strategic plans, you might have lots of different formats, and more cities now are going to have a web-based plan format. That we're not going to print books anymore. That you could just go to the web. And I'll mention right now, the city of Plano just won a national award for its comprehensive plan. So if you're interested in a model of what a good plan looks like, you might go to Plano's webpage and see what they've done. And it's entirely web-based now, right? So.
Yep. Yeah. PlanoTomorrow.org, if you're curious.
So, purposes of comprehensive planning, it's a design process and a decision-making process. It's a means to a future. Again, what is the vision that you're trying to achieve? You get to evaluate alternatives, which really this is the time when you really look at alternatives. How are we going to lay out the city? How are things going to interrelate? And it's a way of reaching consensus among the public through the public participation process. I'll bet you that you have as many ideas of the future of the community as you have people in the community, probably plus one or two. And the comprehensive planning process is a way to get all those people working together toward a somewhat common approach. You have wide varying perspectives in terms of time, extent, topics, but you need to be visionary. You need to be looking out 10 to 20 years. Don't plan for today, because if you plan and build for today, you're behind already. So be looking at and just think about what were things like 20 years ago. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have Uber, we didn't have lots of things that have affected how we live in our community. But this is the time that you get to put your futurist hat on and say, what is our community going to be like in 20 years? And how can we plan for that in the future? So just real briefly, one approach to comprehensive planning, the contents. You're probably going to have a historical background, but if you think about it, you don't start with a blank slate. You have stuff on the ground, and there's some history behind that and historical resources that you might want to look at, so you want to address that. You look at the environmental and social setting. There might be environmental constraints, floodplains, old dumps, noise contours, lots of things that might be out there that might affect how you lay out land uses. Look at the demographic trends. Do you have an aging population? Do you have a growing population? Do you have a population that's changing in ethnicity? They all have different impacts, so you need to kind of be aware of some of those. And then identify the vision of the future. What is it that you want to be when you grow up? And then identify some goals and objectives and how to get there. You're going to have a land use plan of what the future land uses may look like in the future. A transportation plan to provide movement between those different land uses. You're going to have a community facility plan, because community facilities are the one direct thing that government has a direct responsibility for. So City Hall, parks, schools to some extent, and I realize that in Texas, schools are called independent school districts for a reason, but hopefully that you can work with the school district so that their school sites do not cause you a problem down the road. One of my big frustrations is that we build these big arterial roadways with high volumes of traffic, and the school goes and puts an elementary school right next to it and says, no, we need to have a 20-mile-an-hour school zone right there. Well, we built the big arterial road to get people through there efficiently and fairly quickly, and now they've kind of messed things up. Why couldn't they have bought that school site a little further into the neighborhood? And there's an asterisk against those three things, and those are the only three asterisks you'll see on my list. And the reason is that in Chapter 213 of the Local Government Code, it says It doesn't require a city to have a comprehensive plan, so you don't have to have one. But unlike states like California and Florida, which require comprehensive plans and require specific elements within the comprehensive plan, Texas says you can have one, but if you have one, you need to at least address land use, transportation, community facilities. So your comprehensive plan needs to at least address that, and then beyond that, it's entirely up to you what else you want to cover. So you might also include drainage, typical problem area that people want to address, public utilities, including communications. Some cities, anybody here from the town of Westlake? Town of Westlake actually laid fiber optics. The city laid the fiber optics within the street rights of way and then leased them back to the telecommunications providers. So that was kind of a unique approach. Now, Westlake's not exactly a typical of all cities in terms of the resources available, but think about all those other, cell towers was an issue, and so you might want to think about how you handle those kinds of communications. Waste, solid waste, wastewater, hazardous waste, where does that go? And you can't just rely on somebody picking up and carrying it away. Where is it? Where are they taking it away to? Household hazardous waste. Most people don't realize that there's probably a lot of household hazardous waste under your kitchen sink or out in your garage. And how are you going to handle that? Public safety in terms of police and fire. Fire typically, or EMS typically likes to have a 5-minute response time. And in the old days, we just had to assume that equated to about a 1.5 mile circle around the fire station. Now with GIS, we are actually able to estimate by tracking each roadway a 5-minute response time and see where there might be gaps in that. As part of our plan, we might be looking at how do we fill those gaps. Disaster response and preparedness. Too often, the emergency management plan and the disaster mitigation plan are completely separate, often done by the fire department with no relationship to the comprehensive plan, make sure that they kind of interrelate with each other. Some of you may recall that the city of Oakland, California had a big fire in Oakland in the hills, and the big problem was that the roads were so narrow that with people leaving to get down and evacuate, were blocking the way for the fire trucks to go up the roadway. So think about issues like that. Economic development. Most site selectors love that cities have comprehensive plans, because that means the city has taken some time to think about how they're going to protect investments in their community. If I'm going to spend 10, 20, $30 million in your community on a new factory, I want to know that it's going to have adequate resources, adequate infrastructure, and you're not going to allow some other land use that might adversely affect it come near. So that's why site selectors like that. But business recruitment is typically only a small portion of new growth, job growth in your community. Also think about the existing businesses, being able to retain those jobs so that if they want to grow and expand, they're not forced to move outside your community. How are you fostering that? Historic preservation, housing, health, social services, urban design, all issues that you might cover in your comprehensive plan. Benbrook was a little unique in that its capital improvements plan was actually a chapter in its comprehensive plan. The idea that, remember, capital improvements was one of those proactive measures to implement planning, actually making that part of the plan to make sure that it's included. City of Georgetown at one time, their annual budget was part of their comprehensive plan, because they figured where we're spending our money, that's how we want to get to our plan. So all kinds of ways to think about how to make the plan overriding. So who should be involved? Elected officials obviously have to approve the plan. Remember, it needs to be adopted by ordinance. Appointed officials like you all, staff, consultants, neighborhood association, interest groups, chambers of commerce, in short, everybody. Get everybody involved to the extent possible. Now, some cities will use a citizens advisory committee. Other cities are so small that they're lucky they can get P&Z members The P&Z serves as that advisory committee. But the idea is to try to get a broad cross-section of the community to put their input into it. One of the Gattis laws of planning, my students know that I have a few Gattis laws of planning, one of which is that planning is a political process. If you don't have political buy-in to your plan, it's just gonna sit on the shelf. So the idea is to make sure that people buy into the plan, they share the vision, and that way you can get it implemented. Otherwise, it's just a meaningless exercise that you go through. Like I said, it's an opportunity for consensus building, lots of ways that you can get community input. There's surveys, there's public meetings, citizen advisory committees, or charrettes. Is everybody familiar with what a charrette is? A charrette actually means little cart in French, but the idea is that you bring in some design professionals to work with that, and I hate the word, stakeholders in the community to kind of go through a very intensive design development process, typically over a long weekend where you throw out ideas, design people bring in the suggestions, and you kind of refine that to come up with an overall plan. Yes, sir.
Speaking of citizen involvement, in your experience, what's the best way to foster that in an environment where traditionally the lowest voter turnout we have are for elections that involve only city places for commissioners and mayor?
Well, for better or worse, there is no one way to do it, and in fact, you really need to do all ways. There are some people who still rely on newspaper notices, but then I think it was Doug that mentioned Nextdoor and other social media platforms to get people involved, because every generation is going to have their own way that they're going to connect in. And there's lots of ways, with social media, there's lots of ways to get input too. Facebook and those kind of approaches. But the best way is to do as many ways as possible to get as many people involved. A lot of cities go now to the elementary schools to get input from them. If you think about it, who are we planning for? We're planning for them, so let's get their input as well. And you get some interesting ideas, and some of them are pretty intriguing. So how do you use the plan? Use it as a basis of zoning and subdivision regulations. So as you make approvals of zoning cases and subdivision plats and variances, being able to rely back and say this is in conformance with the comprehensive plan is one of the best arguments for support. State law says that zoning shall be in conformance with the comprehensive plan. Other states, not so much Texas, use the comprehensive plan for growth management purposes. We kind of laughed that I mentioned the House Land and Resource Management Committee actually had an interim charge one year on growth management, and their conclusion was growth is good, let's do it. But a lot of cities, and actually a lot of counties are realizing that uncontrolled growth causes problems. And how can we plan for, how can we manage that? It's becoming more and more an issue. Comprehensive planning could be an important part of your annexation program. And in fact, the annexation ordinance as it currently stands requires that you have a 3-year annexation plan. Now I mentioned as it currently stands because in a week or so the legislature goes back into session, and annexation is one of those things they're also going to look at restricting cities' ability to do. Basis for capital and annual budget decisions. Where do we spend our money? Where do we build the streets and parks and stuff? That should be part of the comprehensive plan. If you all have impact fees under Chapter 395, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. That needs to be done as part of a 10-year capital improvement plan and also a plan for land use assumptions. Well, all those kind of flow right out of the comprehensive plan. So being sure that you coordinate those and also park dedication exactions. Basis for economic development decisions. Where are you going to attract people? What kinds of incentives you might use might be related to the plan. and then basis of communication. So if you're in a position where you're gonna do comprehensive plan amendments, you adopt the plan by ordinance, you're going to amend it on a periodic basis. How do you look at those plan amendments? One is you're gonna look at an administrative review, have they given everything you need to make an evaluation? And then do a planning review, look at the big picture, how does the change meet your planning goals? So here's an example of a land use plan amendment. So that was the current plan, and there was a proposal for a mixed-use development in that location. The developer said, no, we just want to do a traditional shopping center, and we want some multifamily as well. So they came in with that proposed change, and so Planning and Zoning Commission considered that change. You need to think through, is this the best use of the land in that location for the long term? Not just the short term, not just because the developer wants to do something, but the developer might have a good idea, but is it the best thing to do at this particular location? And be careful not to simply react to cyclical market demands. You know, one year, single family might be hot, another year, multifamily might be hot, another year, commercial might be hot. Be careful that you don't succumb to always changing for that, but step back and say, no, long term, we need to have a certain amount of single family, a certain amount of commercial as we move forward. Look at environmental constraints, maybe what they propose to do, is it gonna work in that particular location? And does that land use make sense in that location? Are there conflicts with adjacent uses? Is there adequate utility service, et cetera? Thoroughfare plan amendments, most often the developer wants to do away with a thoroughfare because he didn't want to build it. And that might be okay, but that's going to have ramifications on the rest of your thoroughfare network. So is it going to create traffic problems in another part of town? Does it maintain connectivity or circulation through the community? Connectivity is, as developments occur, is there connections between those developments so that you have more than one way to get from one place to another? And a typical, you know, we got these 3 pods here, and the only way to get, if I live there and I want to go see somebody there, only way is I have to go down, get on the arterial, and go back up. And there should be some connections between those 2 pods so that we have better connectivity, better circulation. Helps disperse the traffic congestion. A lot of the new urbanists like the grid system for exactly that reason. There's lots of different ways that you can get from one place to another just by going on a different block. Bottom line is avoid choosing short-term gains over long-term benefits. Always think of that. A couple of special flavors of planning, capital improvements we've talked about. Capital improvements, by definition, is something worth over $1,000 and has a life over a year. But in this context, we're typically talking about streets and drainage and buildings and parks, etc. And we look at what are we going to build this year, because we're going to make sure we got money in the budget to build for that year. What are we going to build over the next 5 years? What are we going to build over the next 10 years, because that fits into our impact fee study. And then what are we going to build over 20 years, because that may be what the bond is that we're issuing to be able to pay. So looking at all those different horizons, how are we going to build things so that we don't overextend ourselves and not be able to pay for things. Or, God forbid, we have to raise taxes. Disaster mitigation planning. As part of our planning, be looking at those hazards that might come up and how can we plan our community to be more resilient. How can we avoid building in risky areas? How can we mitigate risks? Those kinds of things. Most common thing that you'll come across is the floodplain and the FEMA standards for the 100-year floodplain. And hope all you know that a 100-year floodplain doesn't mean it only comes every 100 years. It means it has a 1% probability of happening in any given year. So you can have multiple 100-year floods within a 100-year period. In fact, there are some statistics that show it's not uncommon to have 100-year floods within the life of a mortgage. So be prepared. So the floodplain maps simply show the probability of flooding in our area, basically riverine flooding. The 100-year flood is a fixed volume of water at this point in time. So you got this volume of water coming down. The existing floodplain goes across. Now, FEMA's regulations, in their wisdom, allow you to fill in the floodplain. And you only have to build to the 100-year flood level. But think about it, you got this volume of water coming down the hose, you squeeze it in, what's gonna happen to the water level? It's automatically gonna go up. So FEMA's regulations automatically put water in people's houses. Then the reason is FEMA's rules are not for planning purposes, they're for insurance purposes. So they only look at risk today, and if you built according to that risk, that meets their criteria. But now think about, number one, it doesn't account for changes in impervious area upstream. So in the future, we all know there's probably gonna be more houses, more concrete, more impervious area upstream, and what's that gonna do? It's gonna increase the volume that's coming down. And then obviously you got the problem of water coming in people's houses. Most cities have a 1-foot freeboard or 2-foot freeboard. So FEMA already allows you to squeeze in the floodplain, and then they have another part of the floodplain called the floodway. So if you're running across that means something specific. The floodway is the area that has to be kept open so that if you squeeze in, the flood level goes up no more than 1 foot. And that's that area in there that you gotta leave. So it's gonna go up 1 foot. So most cities have a 1-foot freeboard to protect from future flooding. A lot of cities now go to a 2-foot freeboard just to have a little extra. Some cities actually look at ultimate flooding conditions. They forecast what the future flood will be and then look at that. So lots of different ways to approach it. The other pictures, that's Galveston, the Hotel Galvez, before Hurricane Ike, after Hurricane Ike. See anything missing? And this is actually the Bolivar Peninsula after Ike. You notice that there's one house left. That house was built to FEMA standards, actually built out of concrete. Everything else got wiped out. Well, that was an approach to hazard mitigation. How are we doing on time?
Oh, you got about 2 minutes, or 5 minutes.
Oh, you got questions?
I do.
Sure.
Okay, a lot of times we want to avoid bias because, from my own experience a couple days ago with our Fort Worth Zoning Commission, we have a commissioner who expressed obvious bias, not necessarily for residents, but more about development. And there's a concern there because there's always a public perception, that our bodies, need to, whether they be a commission or board, need to be unbiased, objective, and at least listen to all testimony fairly and with equality. But when you have a commissioner that might make a statement that shows obvious bias, that can infect the perception of the integrity of that particular body. So, and a lot of that sometimes has to also do with a lack of intelligence about the area that's being discussed and affected, and as well as the lack of knowledge that board and commission members might have about a particular area. And I know it's hard, and that's why we have representatives on boards and commissions from all over the city. But what are some solutions that could be suggested to resolve, issues of bias and issues of where there's lack of knowledge about an area?
Well, the answer is education and education, but yeah, in an ideal world, and it wasn't part of my presentation, and Ann Bagley, who will speak after me, may touch on some of this. In an ideal world, you're going to present an open, objective mind up until the hearing is closed. So when the public comes in, if the public comes in and they know that you've got your mind already made up, they feel like it's a useless cause. or, it's fixed, or it's rigged, all those issues. And preferably, you should maintain an objective, open, not let people know where you're leaning until the end of the public hearing. Once the public hearing is closed, and that's the time when you can start arguing with each other about, I like this, I like that. Even to the point where you really shouldn't be talking to people outside the public hearing process, because, most people want to meet outside the public hearing to talk, kind of bend your ear. The best thing to do is get them to come to the public hearing, present their case to everybody, so there doesn't appear to be some link there.
Yeah, because I'm aware that, public education is a really, really big thing too, because there are a lot of residents that have no clue about the process.
Yeah,
So
it goes both ways.
It's very incumbent upon cities to make sure that there's an easy way to access that information as far as how things go. Because I'm a very inquisitive guy. That's how I ended up on the Board of Adjustment. So, the more I learn, the more I realize the general public has a lack of knowledge in that area, and it's very difficult in some cases to acquire that knowledge. So.
Now, when I mentioned, not, clue people to your leanings till the end of the hearing, that's especially true for the Zoning Board of Adjustment, because unlike the P&Z, you are a quasi-judicial board. And so you're by definition, you're looking at evidence and making your decision. And it may be just a reminder training to members of the board about their role. Other thing I was going to mention though is for the P&Z, my observation is that in big cities like Houston, Dallas, and Austin, it's much more common for the commissioners to be much more politically oriented. And I've gotten into arguments sometimes with people about, should you talk to the applicant before the hearing or not? In big cities, sometimes that's common practice. It's expected for the developer to come in and talk and for neighborhood groups to talk. My preference is to try to avoid that as much as possible. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Chapter 395, Local Government Code.
Yeah.
The Capital Improvement Plan. The Planning and Zoning Commission has been tasked with serving as the Capital Improvement Advisory Committee.
Mm-hmm.
So you laid out a list of plans that have a price tag associated with them. And from your impact fee, a income derived from the impact fee that goes toward that project. That's all quite clear. Where some of the confusion occurs is in the last part of 395, where the city council amends the capital improvement plan either by scope or cost. My question is, do those changes need to come back before the Capital Improvement Advisory Committee and be a part of a public hearing to amend the capital improvement plan that the city council previously approved? Is that at all clear?
Yeah, you're probably not going to like my answer, but you are an advisory committee. Council can do pretty much what they want to do. So depending on, if they're switching out projects completely, you might argue that, yeah, that needs to be redone. But if they're just changing the scope of the project, that's different. We're going to talk more about Chapter 395 later, but Chapter 395 is a system that allows the city to collect funds to pay for off-site improvements. A development, a subdivision may, they'll build everything they need to inside their community, but also it may require that the water treatment plant be expanded. And so this is a way to help collect the fees for that. In the old days, pre-1984, 86 or so, cities just kind of made up what they called capital recovery fees. Home builders got all upset about that and came in and complained to the legislature and said, no, we need to have a more formal system of doing that. State adopted it, and to the home builder's chagrin, the impact fees turned out to be higher calculated than they were under the old capital or recovery fees. But to do a impact fee, you can do water, sewer, roads, and drainage. Most people do water and sewer. People up in the North Texas area do roads to some extent, but not everybody. And there's only a few people who do drainage impact fees, because there's a better way to do that through the drainage utility fee. You figure out what your growth rate's gonna be, you figure out what the capital improvement needs are, and then you allocate the cost of the new growth to the new people. You can't make the new people pay for existing problems. So you've got to separate that out. And then you do that by adopting a capital improvements program and then funding projects through the impact fee system. It works good in some cases, and others it doesn't. Yes.
Sorry. So yeah, because that was my next question. It had to do with, well, in our case, transportation impact fees in Fort Worth. And from my research, other communities suffer from the same issue where they're collected for new development. Okay, that's established, but it doesn't come back to that community. It seems to go into a general pool where others decide, oh, we have greater needs over here, according to them, and money gets spent, like you said, for existing infrastructure as opposed to growing and enhancing the developing new infrastructure. So we're seeing a lot of negative impact on, from new development that's, just hitting existing residents and upsetting them more and more. And of course, it's starting to impact property values as well, which is of course affecting the tax base. So
The existing residents shouldn't be paying impact fees because they're
No.
already.
Well, what I'm saying is that, when we have new development nearby existing residents, so it's impacting, in our case, transportation. We already have, inadequate transportation infrastructure, let's say. Then we have all sorts of exploding new development nearby. And like you said, basically development should help with infrastructure, not impede it. So in our case, we're seeing a lot of impediments towards development. And what's, like I said, if you have new development, they're paying transportation impact fees. That's not being utilized in that area.
Yeah.
And then life there gets a little worse and a little less attractive and desirable, which affects.
Yeah. Typically what will happen is the city will divide the city up into service areas.
Yeah.
And then impact fees collected in that service area need to be spent in that service area.
Is there any regulation requiring that?
Probably not, but that's by I want to say case law, but and I don't recall specifically what the statute says, but.
Yeah, because I'm coming up against that, because I tell people, I'm just on the Board of Adjustment, I'm not on all these other things, and I'm not city council. But, there needs to be an answer so that people know what direction they can take to have that voice and have an effect in that particular area. Because when money gets collected and it doesn't get utilized in the way it's intended, on paper, that people need to be able to redress that.
I would look at local government code chapter 395. It's not very long. Doesn't take a long time to read, but I would look at that.
That's state statute?
Yeah,
Okay. Local government code?
yeah, 395.
And in a former life, I actually worked on the drafting of 395, so if there's something in there that you don't like, don't blame me.
Thank you.
Okay, I think, Dave, are you at a good
Yeah.
stopping spot now? Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break and come back.